Hi, I'm B from Nectar and in today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to assemble MySeeker 3D print files. If you haven't already, they're available for purchase down the description below, but let's get to figuring out what the print settings you're going to need are. First up, the STLs should work in any slicer program, but you will have to do some auto repairs on some of the models. Due to how I've modeled them, they've ended up with twisted normals and a couple of weird gubbins, so just make sure you run the auto repair and they'll work just fine. You need to make sure you print the pieces at a 0.10mm layer height with a 0.4mm nozzle, and I find an infill of 10% works best. And make sure you use supports. I do also recommend a brim for the smaller pieces. The only piece that has a required orientation is the part labelled upper crotch. You'll be sliding the chest pieces onto it, and it's going to need a lot of force. So any orientation that isn't flat, as shown here, will make a print that snaps rather easily. It takes me about a full day of printing to get a Seeker finished using 2 printers. They might be small pieces, but they're lots of small pieces. And they're also fairly complex shapes, which is going to add to the print time. So what are the tools you're going to need? Well, you're going to need some plastic trimmers, some pliers, some super glue, and maybe some sandpaper. So to begin with, make sure you've definitely printed off all the pieces. There should be about 73 pieces if you're doing the base Seeker design. Now, you might not have that many in your files that you download, and that's because for things that are symmetrical, like the limbs, I've only included the right-hand side so that you can mirror it to make the left. Once you've made sure you printed off all the pieces, you're going to want to save some of that filament you've used as the pins. Now you can use metal pins, but I've designed it so that you can use the filaments to work with it. Now, it is not going to be a slide-in pin like you're expecting. Due to the way 3D printing works, all the pinholes are supposed to be the same size, but they're not. So you will find that you end up having to trim your filaments into almost a cone or spiked tip so that you can actually slide it all the way in. Starting off, let's do the arms. Now I recommend that you assemble each limb individually. It's going to make it a lot easier at the end. I can tell this is the left arm because the pinhole is on the left-hand side. Same for the hand. Once you've lined them up correctly, snip your filament into that cone shape that I was talking about, and you should be able to just insert it straight in. Now, this can be a rather delicate piece to assemble if you make the filament too big, so make sure you do it slightly smaller than you think you need. It should just slot in and stay in by friction, and now it can hinge around to help transform and stay in place in robot mode. Next up, we want to assemble the midsection of the arm, and we're going to put it in between the forearm piece. You'll notice that the slot holes in the forearm line up with where the pinholes are on the midsection. That's to be your elbow joint and your slider joint. Make sure you get the right mid-arms, otherwise they're not going to line up properly. Once again, cut the filament into cone tips, and I find that for longer pieces like this, a single bit of filament won't actually go all the way through consistently, so I end up doing 2 cones. Next up is a piece that can break quite easily. It's attaching the shoulder to the mid-arm. Now, make sure that you've got the correct shoulder, and you can tell this because there's a bevel on the back side of the shoulder. Now you'll notice I'm rocking it back and forth a lot without actually putting it all the way in. This is me sanding it with itself to stop it from snapping. If you don't do this, the mushroom peg will twist off as you turn the bicep. Next up is the shoulder joint itself. These are 2 small pieces, and again, they're mushroom pegs that can snap if you do it wrong. So make sure you cut off any teardrop shapes and sand it with itself, or get a bit of sandpaper. Once that's in nice and happily, you can line up the holes and snip your filament to fit once again. Last bit for the arm is the null raise. Now, you're going to need 2 pieces for this, the actual null ray itself and the handle. This does mean that you're going to want to put a blob of super glue inside of the port, and then I recommend getting some pliers to then twist the handle into the socket. Once the super glue is definitely set, you can insert it into the shoulder port. You might find you need to twist it a little bit to get it in initially, but once it goes, it should slide all the way in. The next step I recommend doing is making the nose cone / cockpit section of the jet, which is going to be the middle of the chest. First up, we're going to take our main body piece and we're going to insert the glass into it. Make sure you're careful doing this, as if you get the wrong angle, you can snap those dividing border bits. You may also find, depending on print tolerances or filament used, the tabs can be a bit too tight to get the glass to fit in. So I recommend, again, sanding or trimming the edges a little. Now, the central piece does have a front and back. It slightly tapers inwards more to the front. Then you have your two triangle glass pieces. The wider one wants to go above on the side with the ball joint peg, and the narrower one wants to go on the bottom. Once you've inserted all of those, we can work on the actual nose cone piece. You're going to want to take your nose cone tip and insert it into the nose cone body. You may find you need to superglue this to get it to stay. Sometimes it stays in fine. Again, print tolerances are the biggest issue here. Next up, you're going to want this little tiny hinge piece. It has a flat side and a slightly rounded side. The rounded side you want on the bottom so that it matches with the rest of it. Insert it into the nose cone body, line it up with the pinholes, and once again, trim your filament to fit. Once you've got that all in place, you can line up the hinge with the cockpit body and do the same thing. Once it's all together, you can hinge the nose cone all the way around. Next up is the head. Now I've included two Seeker head designs, but they both assemble the same way. First up, you want to get the helmet piece and insert the eyes into it. This can be the trickiest part because you actually have to insert it down and then hook it around the eyebrow section. I find a flathead screwdriver can help to sort of nudge it into place, or pliers to brute force it. Next up is the faceplate, which you should be able to just insert over the top. You'll know it when you got it right because the top of the faceplate should be flush with the eyes. Once your faceplate's inserted, your head's finished and you can attach it to the ball joint. I recommend the wiggle waggle solution to get it to fit. Again, it's slightly sanding it as you put it on, so as you twist it and wiggle it, it helps it actually fit properly. We're going to put that to one side now and create the side chest plate pieces that it will attach to. You're going to want to make sure you have all the necessary pieces as shown here, and for the central chest vent pieces, I'm currently using the flat one in this example, but there is two alternate styles of round turbines and grilled vents, which you can choose beforehand to customize. To insert it, just press it straight into the chest plate piece. You might notice that it's actually a slight rectangle and not a perfect square, so make sure you got it so that lengthways it's longer and it'll fit first try. You know if you've got it wrong because it really won't. The next step is to insert one and only one of the chest pieces into the upper crotch section. Again, wiggling it back and forth should help it slide in nicely. Now before we attach the other half, you're going to want to trim your filament so that you have a nice long stick in the middle of that central hole. Then you can feed through your nose cone and cockpit section from earlier, trim the end off so that it will line up in the other chest piece, and now for the tricky part of sliding in the other chest piece while also fitting it into the pinhole. I'm doing it relatively easy here because this is my 7th time assembling this Seeker design, but I could assure you, those earlier ones were a lot more of a hassle. Once it's in though, it should all be locked nice and tight, and you can push the nose cone and cockpit down so that it's flush with the crotch. The last piece for the torso is to insert those waist color panels in. They don't need any glue, they just pressure fit quite nicely. Now we can attach our arms from earlier. We're going to snip our filament again into a cone shape and assemble that top shoulder piece. Make sure you line up the pinholes correctly and then slide the filament into place, locking it all together. Make sure you do the same on the other side, and now your Seeker is armed and dangerous. But these Seekers never skip leg day, so let's build those. The first thing I recommend doing is adding some super glue onto that little indent in the main leg piece and attaching the leg color panel. I've designed it like this so that you can print the color panel flat with no supports needed. Next up is the foot. Now on the deco I'm doing here, both of the foot pieces are black, but that central foot piece can be a different color to be accurate to characters like Starscream, and you just slide it in from the top. It shouldn't need any super glue if you slide it in. If you press it in from the front, it will. Next up is to attach the thruster to the main foot piece. This should just be a nice pressure fit. Once that's sorted, line up the pinholes with the ankle holes and trim your filament into the cone shape to assemble it all together. Once that's in, you can do the same with the front toe piece, slide that over onto the main foot, and trim your filament. Next up, you're going to want your leg locker. This piece slides into the back of the leg, and you'll notice that one side's got a slight bump ridge. That wants to go on the inside of the leg. Once you line it up with the pinholes, you can again insert the filament, and then make sure you use some pliers to move it back and forth. I find these pieces can get stuck quite easily if you don't, so this helps loosen up any excess filament that's in the way. The next step is to get your mid-leg section sorted. Now, just like the elbows, the knee pins are slightly off-center so that they line up with the sliding track piece. Now you're going to want to pin this, and I find that a single strand of filament very rarely makes it all the way through, so I do 2 pieces on either side. And now this is just like the shoulder mushroom peg. You're going to want to make sure that you rotate it as you put it in to sort of help sand it as it goes in. Next up is for the tail fins. You're going to want to put some super glue on the top tail fin to insert the color panel. And make sure you push it flat and let it sit for a couple minutes. Once that's sorted, line it up on top of the side tail fin hinge piece and shove your filament all the way through. Once that's sorted, make sure the slot on the main lower leg piece doesn't have any excess filament. Line up the side tail fins and then shove a very narrow piece of filament through. I find that it quite often gets stuck on this piece because the lower leg is so long and has so much potential for inconsistent layers. So you end up cutting it thinner than you need to so that it will actually go all the way in. Next up is the hip hinge. Insert that into the hip block and put in your filament. These are symmetrical either way, so it doesn't matter which hip hinge you've got. They're both the same. The last step for the legs is to insert the knee vent panels. These are tiny color pieces that are a bit tricky to get in at first, but once you got it at the right angle, you should be able to push it all the way in and it will just go. As you can see here, my right leg went in just fine, but I had a bit more difficulty with my left leg. Printer tolerances, they sure are great. Next up, we're going to move our legs to one side and we're going to assemble our crotch pieces. Now, the butt flap piece is going to attach to the back half of the crotch, and you want to make sure that the flat side is on the outside. Once again, line it up with the pinholes, trim your filament to fit, and slide it all the way in. Now, insert the hip mushroom pegs into the back half of the crotch, attach the crotch mushroom peg into the mushroom slot, and finally put the front crotch piece on top to lock it all together. This can be one of the most frustrating parts of the assembly, as everything wants to explode apart. So I recommend sometimes tabbing the legs together can help them stop falling apart, and make sure you rest it flat on a table so that you can just press down on it to lock it all together. Once everything is how you like, there should be a little gap in the very bottom of the crotch. This is intentional because that is the slot for you to insert your super glue. We're not gluing the legs stuck, we're just putting a layer of super glue there so that it stays slightly thicker than the print and doesn't mush itself as you move it. If you don't, you're going to have very loose hips and they're not going to want to stand. Next up, it's time for the back panels. You're going to want your main piece and then the 2 flap plates. Line them up with the pinholes and then insert the filament before you do anything else. Make sure the rounded side of the flap is on the outside. This is going to line up with the cockpit section in jet mode. Make sure your back tab slot is fully cleared out of any support material, and then you can use the tab that's on the back plate to just slide it all together. It's a bit tricky to line up, but once you do, it should all just fit perfectly. And you can use those 2 top tabs to line it up with the shoulder pieces. You may find that those 2 top tabs can pop out slightly as you're moving other pieces. That's fine, it's supposed to. That way it doesn't snap. We're almost there! Next step is the wings. Make sure it's clear of any support material, and then you can get your inner wing stripe pieces. There should be a slightly thinner one that goes on the inside, and a slightly thicker one that goes on the outside. I recommend using super glue to keep these in place, but depending on how good the print is, sometimes they just fit with friction. Once your wing's fully assembled, you can make sure you move the arm out of the way and slot it into that mushroom slot right there. And if you're doing just the regular Seeker design, then you're done! Next up, I'm going to show you how to assemble the cone head parts, but if you're not interested in that and just want to see how to transform the figure, skip to this timestamp on screen now. So when you're assembling the cone head variant, you're not going to want to print off any of the nose cone or cockpit sections of the base Seeker, and you're also obviously not going to want the head design. The first thing you're going to want to do is take your base head piece and your mushroom peg and insert some super glue into the slot like you did for the null rays. Then we can take our pliers and insert it, and that will be drying in the background while we assemble the faceplate. Your first step is to insert the eyes into the faceplate, I recommend pliers and pressure for this one. It can be, again, just as tricky as the standard Seeker design, so just be patient. Once you've forced it in, you may find that it's moved out some excess filament into the eye sockets. That's where the push pin comes in to help clear it up. Once that faceplate's sorted, we can now insert it onto the thinner tab on the main head block. After you've assembled the face, you can attach the color panel to the back of the head. And then we can take our front and back halves of the main helmet. Depending on printer tolerances, you may need to trim those two tabs on the top to have a slight chamfer, to then fit the nose cone tip on top. Other times it just fits on with a little bit of wiggling. While you don't need super glue for this part, I do recommend super glue for the nose cone tip. It will occasionally pop off when you're transforming if you don't. Next, we can insert the head onto that ball joint stick. Now, it's going to be very tight at first, so I recommend giving it a lot of wiggling to help sort of sand it down. Next, we can insert the stick into the main body piece and cut our filament to create a pin. And finally, we can insert the glass pieces like we did on the standard Seeker design. Now, if you're doing the cone head, you're probably going to want to do one of the cone head's wings. For the thrust design, you're going to want to make sure that you have the central piece done first. Then you can slide the color panel over the middle of it. This might be a bit tricky initially as parts want to flex and whatnot, but once you've got it right, it should just slide into place. Then you can take your thruster turbine pieces and slot those into the top and bottom. The bottom will have a 5mm port on it so that you can attach the null rays in jet mode. If you're doing the ramjet wing design, you're going to want to take the main wing piece, slot in that sort of gas tank section on top, then take the color wing panel and insert it into the main wing piece. This can be quite stiff, and I've genuinely used a hammer to get it in before. Finally, you can insert that into the gas tank. A bit of super glue will help it stay secure, but it is a pressure fit. Now for the dirge wing, you're going to want to just print it like the base wing design. It's nothing fancy. So now that you've assembled your Seeker, it's time to transform it. I'm going to show you how to do the base Seeker design first, and then I'll show you how the cone head works. Your first step is to remove the null rays, and then pull the cockpit section slightly up. This should give you enough freedom to then rotate it all the way around. Then you can swing your nose cone and tip all the way around so that it's one long piece. You'll find that the slider it's on is actually a slight L shape, so you can slide it up so it's flush with those back panels, and then hinge it into the tabs. Next up is the arms. You're going to want to swing the hands up so that they're flat on the side of the arms, spin the forearm so that the hands are behind, and then push on the forearm so it slides all the way up. Once that's sorted, you're going to want to insert the hand through that slight gap in the chest piece. It can be a bit tricky at first, and I find that it's actually better to sort of grab the forearm and twist it in instead of just the shoulder. Once that's in, it should be fairly flat, and you can do the opposite side as well. Next up is the legs. Now, I find that the leg sliders can get a little bit stuck at times, so flip down your leg lockers first, and then wiggle them back and forth so that they eventually slide all the way up. Once they've slid up all the way, you can tap them together and then connect them to the butt flap piece. And now you can fold up your toes so that they're flat with the thrusters. And then spin the main wing piece all the way down and around. Finally, for the side tail fins, we'll flap those down, flip our top tail fins up. The last step of your transformation is to just plug those null rays on, and you're done! The only transformation steps you have to do differently, if you're using the cone head variant, is you're going to want to spin the helmet around the face, then you're going to want to pull the head out on its neck stalk, try and spin the entire head around as best as you can. This can be quite tricky at first if the ball joint's tight, but the more you do it, the more it'll loosen up. Once you've got it so that the pink panel is on the bottom of the nose cone and everything, you should be able to just slide it all the way in. Just like the neck ball joint, this can be a bit stiff initially, but the more times you do it, the more it wears itself down. So you've done it! You've assembled your very own Seeker. If you want to share with me your makes, feel free to tag me on Instagram or send me some pictures on my official Nectar Mechanics Discord server. It's a membership perk available now. And otherwise, I'll catch you next time. Farewell!